Hello and welcome to Story Time. Today we are going to read a wonderful book about, can you guess? It is called Fairy Spell: How Two Girls Convinced the World That Fairies Are Real. Let's see what this book is all about. Here's a lovely picture of somebody sitting by let's see who that is. Yet again, 9-year-old Frances Griffins had fallen into the water. Her expensive shoes were soaking wet. Her mother was furious. Her Aunt Polly asked, "Why do you keep going back to that river?" Frances paused and said, "To see the fairies." "Fairies? That's nonsense," said her Uncle Arthur. Frances and her mother had moved from South Africa to Cottingley, England, while Frances's father was serving in World War I. They were staying with the Wrights, her aunt, uncle, and 16-year-old cousin Elsie. Frances and Elsie, both only children, had become just like sisters. The Wright home sat on the highest point in the village. Behind it stretched a garden, and burbling at the bottom of that garden was a stream. Throughout the summer of 1917, the stream had called to Frances and Elsie, and they spent many happy hours there. Though it was mere yards from the house, they sometimes brought lunch so they wouldn't have to leave for any longer than necessary. Look at that beautiful house on the hill. And down there, the stream. But that day, Frances was on the verge of tears because the adults did not believe her fairy story. Elsie said to her father, "If you let me have your camera and tell me how it works, I'll get a photograph of the fairies." Photography was new enough that many people had never taken a picture before. Cameras could be complicated to use, and Uncle Arthur said no. The girls pleaded with him for days. One July afternoon, he finally agreed. He supplied them with one photographic plate for one picture, meaning they could only take one photograph. Less than an hour later, they reappeared with knowing smiles. There they are, going to the stream, and there's Uncle Arthur. "We've got the photo, I believe," Elsie said. "Will you look?" She squeezed into their small dark room with her father while Frances waited outside. Arthur began to develop the photo. As the image took shape, he thought he was looking at birds or sandwich wrappers until he saw legs and arms. Tiny ones, but they were there. "The fairies are on the plate," Elsa shouted to Frances, who squealed and danced on the other side of the dark room door. Arthur was speechless. Then he laughed. He felt Frances and Elsie were playing a joke, but the girls swore they did only as they said they would, prove that fairies frolicked down by the stream. If anybody else were there, the fairies would not come out, Elsie said. The fairies would not come out for you in 100 years. The adults could not figure out how or if they were being fooled. There they are in the dark room, and there's the photograph with the fairies. Do you think those are real? In September, Arthur again loaned Frances and Elsie his camera. Again the girls scurried down to the stream for a short while, and again they scrambled back with a photo the adults could not believe. Elsie was holding the hands with a gnome. A gnome. This time Arthur was more annoyed than amused. The girls still would not confess. So Arthur forbade them from using his camera ever again. But Polly had quietly begun to feel that somehow the girls were telling the truth. On November 8th, 1918, Frances sent a friend in South Africa a letter and enclosed one of the fairy photographs. On the back of the photo she wrote, "Elsie and I are very friendly with the stream and the fairies that live there. It is funny I never used to see them in Africa. It must be too hot for them there." There's the photo of her shaking hands with the gnome. And there's the aunts and the uncle. Two days later, World War I ended, and Frances's father returned, and the Griffiths family moved to Scarborough, a town about 2 hours away. The following summer, the girls' mothers attended a lecture on fairies. Polly showed the speaker the photos that Frances and Elsie had taken and asked, "Are fairies real?" There's her father coming home, and there she is at the lecture. I wonder, are fairies real? News of the photo spread to Edward Gardner, a man who was well known for speaking on topics of the supernatural, and then to Arthur Conan Doyle, the author who created the world-famous detective known as Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle was no stranger to the possibility of fairies. His father said he often saw them. Intrigued, Gardner and Doyle decided to investigate the photos together. For Doyle, the timing was apt. He had already been preparing to write about fairies for The Strand, which was a popular British magazine. Gardner visited the Wrights in Cottingley. He said that Doyle would like to publish the photos with his article, although Elsie and her parents turned them down at first. They eventually agreed, so long as the magazine did not print their real names or identify where they lived. Gardner asked Harold Snelling, a photographer with 30 years of experience, to examine the photos. Snelling said, "This is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen." In fact, Snelling believed that while the photo was being taken, the fairies had even moved. If they moved, they must be real. And if the girls had taken 2 photos, they could take even more. He's examining that photo, and there's Arthur Conan Doyle. Frances was sent to Cottingley so the girls could go out to the stream and summon or call to the fairies. But it rained. Every day, more rain. In the 2 weeks Frances was there in Cottingley, the girls got only 2 hours of sunshine to try to photograph the fairies. There is the rain. Rain, rain, rain. And here comes the sun for just 2 hours down by the stream. But on August 26, 1920, they managed to take 2 pictures. And on August 28th, they took another picture. The 5th and final photo had no Frances or Elsie, only fairies and something else. But not even the girls could say what it was. It looked like a cocoon made out of grass. Arthur Conan Doyle called it a fairy sunbath. There are the girls with the fairies, and there's that strange-looking cocoon. The girls' first 2 photos appeared in the December 1920 issue of The Strand magazine. They called them the most astounding photographs ever published. In Arthur Conan Doyle's article, Frances was called Alice and Elsie was called Iris. So while the girls kept their privacy, their nameless friends from the stream were introduced to the public. The magazine instantly sold out in just 3 days. Everyone was aflutter about the fairy photographs. While some readers thought the girls had made historic discoveries, others thought the photos were fake. And they couldn't grasp how a smart man like Arthur Conan Doyle could believe that they were even real. There's all the people reading that magazine and looking at the photographs. Some doubters pointed out that the waterfall behind Frances was blurry, but the fairies were not. If both the water and the fairies were moving, both should be blurry. Others questioned why Frances was looking at the camera rather than the fairies. Arthur Conan Doyle said the wings were not blurred because a fairy is a combination of human and butterfly, and those bodies doesn't work like those of either people or butterflies. Gardner said Frances was not looking at the fairies because she was used to them. What she was not used to was the camera. But the main reason the 2 men felt the photos were truthful was because the two girls came from decent families and had no history of lying. A few months later, under the headline, "The Evidence for Fairies," the Strand magazine ran Frances and Elsie's last 3 photographs. There she is, with the fairies. And there's the camera. A reporter found out that Alice and Iris were really Frances and Elsie. The attention soon became so overwhelming that the girls were eager to say farewell to fairies. Besides, they were now growing up. Elsie got married in 1926, and Frances got married in 1928. They had children, got jobs, and settled in different parts of England. And people stopped bothering them until 1965. A journalist tracked down Elsie. Then she was 64 years old. The fairy photo frenzy started all over again. "Let's say they are figments of our imaginations, Frances's and mine, and leave it at that," Elsie said. Some people took that to mean that the girls made up the fairies. Others thought that clever Elsie was not admitting anything one way or the other. "What did you say that for?" Frances, now 58 years old, wrote in a letter she wrote to Elsie. "You know very well they were real." In 1976, a TV show filmed Frances and Elsie returning to Cottingley together for the first time since the 1920s. They did not see any fairies. Possibly, they said, because only children can see fairies. There she is. And there they are back at the stream. The next year, an author named Fred Gettings was doing research for a book he was writing about old illustrations. Looking through Princess Mary's Gift book, which had been published in 1914, he was startled by what he saw on page 104. A drawing of fairies accompanying a poem called "A Spell for a Fairy." Those fairies looked almost identical to the ones in Frances and Elsie's photo. But it wasn't until 6 years later that the puzzle of the Cottingley fairies were solved, mostly. In 1983, when Elsie was 81 years old and Frances was 75 years old, Elsie revealed that they had indeed faked the photos. Elsie had wanted to get back at the adults for scolding Frances when she came home drenched, soaking wet from the river. Because Frances was younger, she went along with Elsie's plan. Each copied the fairies from Princess Mary's Gift book onto stiff paper, and then they cut them out and put them on sticks. Well, that was clever, wasn't it? The girls attached long sticks to the backs of the drawings and stuck them into the ground or on a branch. As they snapped the photo, they ripped up the cutouts and scattered the pieces in the stream. All those years earlier, Arthur had looked for, but failed to find those scraps of paper. Neither girl could have had any idea that a backyard prank on their parents would blow up into a front-page prank on the world. There they are, as little kids photographing those fairies. And there's the stream. I can't understand why people were taken in, Frances said. They wanted to be taken in. Frances and Elsie kept the secret almost their whole lives. Even their parents had never learned what they'd done. Part of the reason the girls did not want to divulge the truth earlier was to spare Arthur Conan Doyle and Mr. Gardner any embarrassment. But by 1983, both had passed away. However, while Frances admitted the first 4 photos were faked, she disagreed with Elsie about the last, the photo of the fairy sunbath. Frances insisted it was the world's first photograph of actual fairies. Frances was not especially concerned with whether or not people believed that the photos were real. Shortly before she died, she made clear what she most wanted people to know and to remember and to believe, that there were fairies in the world. And there she is, sitting by the stream with her friend. And you know what happened after that? They lived happily ever after. I hope you enjoyed today's book. If you want to get it, you could probably find it at the library. Take care. Bye-bye.